Hi, Josh.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm exactly the same. What a coincidence.
I'm lying, though. I'm not okay.
I was going to say I'm exaggerating.
Yeah,
but
false stoicism here. Yeah, there's a lot going on, and as I said offline, I'm very excited about the release of Borat 2 tomorrow night.
Well, now by the time this airs, that will already be out there, along with all of its any possible ramifications it may have, including implications for the election. I'm trying to think when this will run. I think this is going to run after the election. Because it may have some. We needn't dwell on that. But Borat may as people know by the time they see this, may in a very oblique way, just because there's a person who enters into it who currently is trying to make sure that Joe Biden doesn't win the election, and the Borat movie casts aspersions of a sort on this said person. We needn't.
So I've heard, yeah.
Let's move to loftier things.
Yes. I was going to mention also, I have a new feature. I'm trying to upgrade my game here, but I have this sound buffer. You see it?
Whoa. I see it. It looks for people who aren't watching but are only listening, it's a thing. How would you describe that? It's the shape of a backstop on a softball field, in which case we would say that you're at home plate facing the backstop, except that it's much kind of closer to you and immediately surrounding you, and it goes almost as high as your shoulders, but not quite. And you're telling me that actually will absorb a sound in an important way?
Allegedly, that's what it was said to do. But this is the extra large model, and in terms of sophomoric salacious jokes, there was a review on Amazon by a one Jeffrey Toobin, and apparently this is the thing that
man, we're really
we're starting low.
Yeah.
No. But this is it seems to it's sort of a fortress that I can hide behind.
Wait, there was a review by the Jeffrey Toobin on the site?
No.
Jeffrey Toobin.
No. I'm referring to the Jeffrey Toobin and the alleged Zoom call where he was caught online.
It would be yeah. So from the to meet the not very high bar of elevating the conversation, we are going to talk about something called the logos, which I think is a very important concept. Maybe we should back up and frame this conversation in a slightly larger context. You had suggested very generously at some point that we should have a few conversations where we explore my worldview.
Yes.
And I want to emphasize this was your idea. This was not my idea. And false humility demanded that I protest briefly.
Sure, you can make those utterances, but if we back up a bit, and this may be an illustration of an aspect of the logos eventually, but in our conversations, you were articulating to me a sort of a sense of wanting to get your message out in a broader way and speak to issues of deep importance that are of value to you and wanting to sort of think creatively on how to get that message across more.
This is true. I mean, there's the related fact that I see myself as having a coherent worldview. I'm not sure it's evident to anyone else that I do, even among the small number of people who might ask themselves the question of whether I have a coherent. What I mean is I've written in like 5 books. I think they add up to something, even though in some ways they seem to be about different things. And the logos actually shows up in 2 of them, by the way. There's a whole chapter on it in The Evolution of God, and it is the on the last page of Nonzero, which was the book before The Evolution of God. There's a quote, Well, from Philo of Alexandria, and I'm looking at it, maybe I don't use the word logos, but he is describing the logos in this quote, which I assume I'll have occasion to read after this, and during this conversation. And meanwhile, the logos, in between my deploying it in Nonzero and the Evolution of God, and now Jordan Peterson bursts on the scene, and he's apparently been writing about the logos for some time, and I think helped popularize the word among a lot of people. I have not read anything he said about it or heard anything he said about it. You have delved a little into some of his lectures where he does deploy the term. So our knowledge is maybe complementary here. I want to talk about the ancient, the use of the term in ancient and philosophy and theology, and my own take on modern applications of it. And then maybe you can fill us in a little on what Jordan Peterson seems to mean by the term. Does that seem?
Yeah, I can try my best. And maybe before we dive straight into the logos, we zoom back for a sec and try to articulate, or maybe you try to articulate the Dharma of Bob in a certain sense of, like, when I hear the term the Dharma, I borrow from the Buddhist conception, which is sort of the way things are, but it's also a way to live in accordance with the way things are to mitigate suffering, unnecessary suffering, in a way. And I feel like there's distinct features of your worldview that hold that near and dear.
First of all, again, false humility demands that I note that you thought of the term Dharma of Bob as being the overarching way to describe the overarching theme of these several conversations. But I like it, I got to say. I am Bob, and I like it. I also want to say, I was listening. So last night, to brush up, I listened to my chapter on the Logos and the Evolution of God, which I haven't read in 11 years. And I read in galleys before the book was published. And I actually make an explicit comparison between the Logos and exactly what you just said about the Dharma. I bring the Dharma in and I say, so the Logos, in a way, like the Eastern, concept of the Dharma, is both the truth about the way things are and the truth about the way you should live in accordance with the way things are. It is both an objective truth and a source of guidance. So,
and it would seem also a kind of a formulaic injunction for how to realize that.
Now you're saying this is your sense of Peterson's take on the Logos, or you're describing the Dharma now?
The Dharma, more the Dharma, but
okay.
but I think, well, I would love to get into that parallel, or the overlap between Logos and Dharma. I think my sense of it, and it's very rudimentary, but my sense is that the Logos became absorbed. It was not a cross-fertilization necessarily, but in the Dharma, the concept of Logos is somewhat implicit. Uh-huh. And so I see some broad parallels between the two.
Now, a final thing I'd say to set up the term, I'd say two things to set up the discussion is, I think one reason, I think that the concept is important today for people who would like to have, a body of ideas that are scientifically respectable, can seem more or less compatible with scientific worldview, and yet I would say not just spiritually rewarding, but even having a theological dimension. Mm-hmm. And in a way, this was, I think, part of the original. Well, this was a very early ancient deployment of the term, because the philosopher and kind of theologian that I've talked about using it in ancient days, Philo of Alexandria, who lived around the time of Jesus. He was Jewish, but he was living in a cosmopolitan kind of Greek milieu. So he's very influenced by Greek philosophy, but he was he was devout in his devotion to the Jewish faith. And he wanted to kind of reconcile these two. So he took a term that can be rendered, the logos, in, a kind of abstract way and in a way that sounds fine so far as sciences goes. And he wanted to be among the people who was making this kind of fusion between philosophy and theology. He was not alone. The book of John in the New Testament is famously rendered as, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That the actual Greek term is translated as word is logos. So what that really says is, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was God and was with God, was kind of in God in some sense, and was God. And so that's probably my final tease is, I think, if you're among those who is asking whether we're living in a simulation, the logos can also be applied to you. And we'll maybe get back to that, if not in this conversation, then later.
And is that because you think logos is in some sense the divine genetic code of evolution?
Well, the term I use in the evolution of God is the divine algorithm. And I use, just in trying to, and this is before everybody was talking about a simulation. It was after the movie The Matrix I wrote this, but before all, people, philosophers and Elon Musk were, going on and on about it. But just for purposes of trying to make clear the idea of the logos, I use the analogy of a video game. And video game having a creator who on the one hand is outside of the system, but on the other hand, who is manifest within it in the sense that the creator, generated the principles that govern the system and guide the characters.
So you see this concept as sort of the linking concept between a maybe pre-rational, religious, sort of mythical worldview and a more rational, scientific understanding.
I wouldn't.
Is that fair?
I think, you could say, in general, Philo of Alexandria's mission was to make, part of his mission was to make the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, more or less, compatible with a more, in his day, modern philosophical sensibility. And so he did a lot of interpreting it allegorically, things that might seem like crazy, implausible miracles to somebody of a secular orientation. He would say, well, that's an allegory. He would go through the Bible and do that. So he was very much about taking what some people would consider old-fashioned theological concepts and rendering and scriptures and rendering them in a more, you might say, respectable to a modern sensibility way. And one of those concepts was an anthropomorphic God. The logos is a way of thinking about God that, notwithstanding my previous analogy to a video game designer, is not so anthropomorphic and is not so hands-on interventionist.
Right.
So in that sense, yes, but I would also say, but it's not just a way of dispensing with the theology. It's a way, well, maybe a term, maybe we should, talk about not just theology, but teleology. The idea that there is a higher purpose. The logos helps, I think, can play a big role in the conversation about how that could be, and this is a firm belief of mine, a person of impeccable scientific credentials with a completely scientific worldview absolutely can believe that there is a larger purpose unfolding on Earth, in the universe, whatever. I believe there's actually reason to think that, but that's more arguable. What I believe is really not arguable. I hate to say it, but I think people who believe that you can't have a completely scientific worldview, even a scientific materialist worldview if you want, and still believe that some larger purpose helps explain why things have the shape they have and the scientific laws have the form they have. People who think that, I forget where I was in that sentence, but anyway, people who think that those two things are incompatible, teleology and scientific worldview, I think are just flat out demonstrably wrong. Sorry, hate to sound obnoxious, but I just think.
And teleology, it not just purpose, but doesn't it convey a sense of directionality?
Purpose typically does. I mean, yeah, because if you take, teleology refers to it entails kind of goal orientation. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, you even take a man-made system that has a goal orientation, like a thermostat, or anything with a feedback system, even a toilet, right? If the water gets too low, that's feedback, and the system gets the water up to a certain level. The thermostat gets the temperature back up to a certain level. So there's movement toward something that is thought of as a goal. And I would say certainly the question of directionality in biological evolution, in human cultural evolution, plays a big role in arguments about whether there's a purpose. And again, those are arguable. Whether there is a purpose, I want to emphasize. I'm not saying I have the revealed truth about that. I just think that in principle, you can have a thoroughly scientific worldview and believe there is a larger purpose. And that, I just think people who disagree are just, I'm sorry again, but confused.
So you have a scientific worldview and you perceive a purpose. And I think that's part of your view is to explain or to articulate then what is the directionality of that purpose. And I know you've written about this, but just to name it as a setup for the discussion of the logos.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the same time, my argument that there is as an empirical matter, directionality, observable, I invoke in the argument that there is purpose, but I don't claim that that's a killer argument. I don't claim I prove purpose or anything like that.
You're just saying there's evidence to suggest.
I think there's evidence more suggestive of it than a lot of people appreciate.
And it doesn't necessarily, I mean, is your purpose predicated on kind of a creator God, or is it sort of built into the mechanism of the universe?
Well, on that point, I guess you could say I'm agnostic, and it's important to understand that the existence of a goal-oriented system needn't necessarily imply a hands-on creator. And a good example, so on the one hand, a thermostat does have a creator. On the other hand, the maker of the thermostat, so organisms, they have goal orientation, right? It's like you observe an animal. If you came from another planet and were some kind of disembodied intelligence that had never seen an animal, and you just observed them, you'd say, well, it seems like one of their goals is to eat stuff. And if you observe them generation after generation, you might say, and those goals like eating stuff and defending themselves, those actually seem subordinate to a kind of larger goal of reproducing, of like getting this genetic material in the next generation. And I think, a lot of biologists would say, yeah, that's a reasonable way to speak. Animals have goals, but they were not imbued by an intelligent designer or, like by a human, by a hands-on creator. They were created by a process, natural selection, which over time generates organisms that themselves have goal orientation. So if I step back and assert that the larger system we're seeing unfold on this planet, biological evolution, cultural evolution, may have a larger purpose, in the sense may be heading towards something that you could say is in some sense, quote, by design. Just as you can say an animal eats, quote, by design, if you view natural selection kind of metaphorically as a designer. I am not saying that the designer of the whole evolutionary system, even if it turns out it does have a goal, the whole system, that doesn't mean the designer is some kind of hands-on, intelligent, like God or anything. And in fact, there are specific scenarios where a process analogous to natural selection, operating at the cosmic level, operating among universes even, could explain how you get goal orientation in an evolutionary process within one of the universes. I will not get into that now, but I'll just say that I was not the first to, well, it's a little, anyway, there are theories out there about what's called cosmological natural selection. Lee Smolin is associated with one. He's a prominent and important physicist. And there's a variant of his theory that could explain this, that he doesn't himself dwell on, but a couple of other people have gotten into, that could explain how an evolutionary system could have goal orientation that's imbued through a process of cosmological natural selection. We should get back to the Logos.
Yeah, I was going to say, so in discussing the Logos, first thing I want to mention, just as a caveat, is that, as I mentioned offline, I was raised by agnostics. Religion was never a discussion in the house. I grew up in a town that was deeply Catholic, and I just felt like a sort of an ostracized outcast in that community. But it wasn't until I got to college that I read the Bible in a contemporary civilizations class, and I remember more or less dozing through the discussion of Logos. It seemed really inscrutable and unintelligible to me.
You do remember the word, though?
Oh, I do remember the word. I remember like a month of discussion around it, I think. And I was probably at that point an obnoxious card-carrying atheist and just sort of prematurely dismissive of the whole thing. And one of the reasons why I mentioned Peterson to you is that, in listening to him, he's making it, in a way, accessible and relevant to just daily living and making sense of the world in a way that doesn't seem like it jettisons rationality at all. Yeah.
If you were going to ask another question, I'd like to interrupt and ask you a question about Peterson. But if you weren't going to ask another question, go ahead and say something.
Well, I was just going to say, I wanted to maybe begin asking you what the general conception of the Logos is, and then how does it play within how you see this sort of biological, cultural development of history. Okay.
Then I would like to interrupt and just ask you, and I know you're not a Peterson scholar, but you've listened to a couple of his religion lectures where he deploys the term Logos. Does what he says about it sound compatible with what I've said so far, or is he emphasizing a different aspect of it?
Right. Any misinterpretations of Peterson are entirely my own, but from what I can gather, it does sound compatible. I mean, it sounds like there's the role that the Logos plays is that it's part of the engine of evolution and the evolving of the good. He doesn't use that term, but it places the development of society and humanity in a trajectory towards approaching transcendent good, is the way I hear what he's talking about.
Right. I think I'd go along with
and because of that, because of its sort of the coding of it, in terms of its divine direction, it's imbued with this sacrosanct dimension or quality.
You mentioned growing up among Catholics, and so this just reminds me that it's not the Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, this kind of very interesting Catholic theologian and philosopher, also paleontologist, scientist, who was for a while kind of ostracized by the Catholic Church. His work is not irrelevant. He must have used the word, he must have drawn on the concept somewhere, but I'm not aware of that. What I'm aware of is that he very much emphasized the idea that biological evolution and cultural and technological evolution were drawing us to this kind of point. And he is also, I believe, the one who famously said, or one of the ones who famously said, God is less in the alpha than in the omega. So in other words, there is a view where it's almost like the divine is taking shape, like the seed of the divine is planted and the divine itself is evolving. That's not necessarily part of the idea of the logos as classically conceived, but it seems to be not incompatible with some.
And that evolving process is itself a creative expression too. The element of creativity to this, it seems like part and parcel of it.
Yeah, very much. So,
but given my background, when I hear things like in the beginning was the Word and the Word was with God and God was the Word, I would just go cross-eyed and it made utterly no sense to me. So I take it you don't think that the logos is just the word per se, which is sort of a
not in the class in our common sense, but apparently the word, as I recall, the word logos, like a lot of ancient words, it's like you can find it used in different ways, and the verb form of it, I think, was one of its meanings was to speak. Another was apparently to count. And there were no doubt others, but there is this, so those are whatever connotations those have. And I think count is interesting because of the notion of, computation, in the noun form, and,
measuring, naming.
It's
connected.
And there's an association with the idea of reason. The idea is like the logos is a reasoning, it's a reasoning principle running through history. It's like a logic shaping the unfolding of life. And it is and it was imparted, the seed was planted kind of at the beginning. And, and again, I think algorithm is a really good, modern word, for illuminating the idea. An algorithm can be a simple, relatively compact set of principles that unfolds into immense richness. And I think that's part of the idea behind the logos. I think the logos.
Would you say that the logos itself is in a process of creative evolution too?
Well, that's an interesting question.
In that you could say that with life, the beginning of life is sort of running under the principle of natural selection, but then as that natural selection evolves into more complex organisms, particularly as come together in humans, the principle of that genetic the principle of the program evolves in a greater degree of complexity than it started with. So it in itself, the program is being updated with more and more complexity and sophistication.
I think so. I mean, because one reason I think so is I think the way Philo of Alexandria would have thought of the logos, and he's not the only one who's thinking about it in those days, but there's a fairly substantial record of his writings about it, if fragmentary record of his own writings. I think he would have thought of it as kind of encompassing just the laws, the physical principle, You drop things, they fall. You know, he didn't understand the modern principle of gravity, but he certainly thought of the world as being governed by physical laws. Those would have been part of the logos, encompassed by it, but they add up to a larger logic, in a sense, that maybe becomes clearer as things unfold over time. And so, yes, I would say, just as we think of the scientific laws as being capable of, in a sense, generating new principles, like, just life itself. We think of that as originating. We don't have a super clear idea of the dynamics, but we think of it as originating from a prebiotic phase, but in accordance with, the laws that govern inorganic, the inanimate world. So life, natural selection is new, and yet compatible with and even generated by prebiotic laws. And similarly, natural selection goes on to generate a process that is also evolutionary, but in some ways different, by which I mean cultural evolution, the evolution of religious ideas, technologies, and so on, which has shaped the general direction of things, since humans really began inventing stuff long, long ago, and began speaking and exchanging ideas and so on. So yeah, the new laws in a sheerly scientific sense kind of come into being. And so, yeah, I think it's fair to think of the logos as being a seed that almost has other seeds within it.
Right. And those seeds manifest in other forms depending on the context that they get planted in. Do you see yourself as to betray my own ignorance here, I had not come across Philo until about a week ago. I started doing some research for this conversation. Do you see yourself as a neo-Philo, Philoist in a certain sense?
Well, I mean, I think I personally am just, I wasn't brought up in a secular environment like you. My parents were devout Southern Baptists, and I didn't remain a Southern Baptist, but it did leave me with an interest in, theological issues. And, I'm very interested in the reconciliation of science with, first of all, anything that can be called spiritual. You and I, as you know, certainly have a common interest in Buddhism. And I think there are parts of Buddhism, although parts of Buddhism as practiced in Asia are just very conventionally religious. There are what you could call naturalistic parts of Buddhism, sometimes called secular parts, that I think qualify as spiritual in some meaningful sense of the term. And I'm interested in that reconciliation, talking about that part of Buddhism in a scientific context. But yeah, beyond that, I'm also, and this is, and by the way, Philo had his mystical side. I mean, we will get in the sense of believing that a kind of contemplative and I think he would say ascetic life can bring one into, well, he would say communion with the divine maybe, but also we might say a more mindful state, among other things. Anyway.
Well, no, actually, I did read your chapter in the Evolution of God on the Logos, and you quote a passage where it sounded like he felt he came to communion with the divine. Or he felt
I mean, I try not to read too much into things, and with Philo, you are dealing with a fragmentary text, some of which isn't preserved, although he was very prolific. There's a lot of it. There are volumes. But
what struck me as interesting about that was that he felt like he fell from it. He had this great communion, and then he lost it.
It's like going on a retreat and coming back.
Right. Well, the parallel I heard was the similarity between the Buddha's own seeking of enlightenment, where he practiced contemplative disciplines, what we call meditation, with renowned yoga masters of his day, and entered into these sort of divine bliss abodes, these divine bliss states. But they didn't last. He came back out of them, and it was in coming out of them that he felt like he was disconnected from an experience of awakening or freedom.
Right.
And it's almost like I actually was seeing this development in the religious structures where the more archaic tend to personify the awakened experience as a divine entity. And it's almost like the Buddha sort of abstracted that even more to the principle of his own awake consciousness, which does tie in some ways to Peterson's view of the sort of the triad or the core elements within which the logos is operating, and why it is sort of this.
What is Peterson's triad?
As I get it, he's basically describing in Genesis that in the beginning there's this formless, chaotic potential, and within that emerges God, which he sort of defines as, I can't tell if it's both consciousness and a deep interpretive structure through which we encounter the world, but it's in a way it's through the recognition of consciousness that order starts to be imposed upon this chaotic dimension, and it seems to be that it's not just the consciousness, but it's the naming and the ordering of the experience through language and through dialogue and through interaction with other that a kind of inhabitable order in his language, and inhabitable order is eked out of this chaotic potential. And, I think for him, that the book of Genesis and probably all the biblical stories are descriptions of phenomenology.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Peterson is very interested in order and chaos. And I think to some extent that interest grows out of profound personal experiences he had along the way. But I do think it's fair to say that the Logos is an ordering principle. Now, I don't know, I'm not aware of ancient texts talking about a relationship between consciousness as we think of it in the Logos, but I'm not an authority. I am not an authority on the Logos. I mean, so that could be there, and it could be something Peterson is bringing to it. I think, and it makes sense that consciousness, consciousness is a whole nother thing we could get in. Sometime if we talk about the Dharma, Bob, for long enough, we will get into consciousness per se. But well,
there was something that I think I caught something in your chapter where you speak about sort of a creative insight that comes, that is born, and then that insight, and this is what Peterson is trying to get to, is that he doesn't use the word insight, but it's almost like the creative insight needs to be, in order for it to take form, it must be instantiated in the body of a human through speech. So I was reading it or listening to him as this chaotic potential in a way is the sort of the undifferentiated field of imagination. And from that kind of disorganized imagination, consciousness that knows it comes online and is able to extract from the field of potentials almost a prototype of an insight for how the world or how the good could be developed in one's experience.
Okay.
So I may be getting too abstract here, but it seems to describe the phenomenology of inspiration, and then the application of that inspiration into form, which is through the body and speech, and brought into the world in that way.
Okay. Let me actually back up, and that reminds me of a footnote. I want to add something I said earlier. I said you could have a strictly scientific worldview, even a scientifically materialist worldview, and still believe in a larger purpose. I would emphasize that you could even be a so-called eliminativist, that is to say, a philosopher who thinks that I think it's fair to say consciousness doesn't exist, which doesn't make any sense to me. But suppose you were that severe and kind of austere in your materialism, and you didn't want to talk about consciousness entering the picture at all, or maybe at most as an epiphenomenon, that is to say, something that's generated by the material world, but doesn't in turn influence the material world. And that I think that I can imagine that doesn't seem as crazy as saying consciousness doesn't exist. But I would emphasize even those views, I think, are totally compatible with a teleology, the idea that there's a purpose unfolding, and I could make the argument for purpose within that framework. That said, I do think consciousness is something, and it's not, and it's challenging to explain. And I gather Peterson is attributing causal, not just causal significance to it, but it sounds like monumental causal significance to it. So like he's saying consciousness enters the physical system and imposes shape and form on it or something.
Yeah, it's by virtue of being conscious that one is able to exert any kind of order over the chaos. Which, and as a meditator, think of the Dharma, it's like, if you think of a meditation, any meditation you've had, there's two broad dynamics that go on in your meditative sitting, right? There's the periods of time where you're wandering. And when you're wandering, it's impossible to exert much control or influence over that dynamic. But as soon as you become awake to the fact that you've wandered and you're back online being present to what's unfolding in real-time events, then you have like at least a foothold in a dimension where you can start to exert order over how you relate and see those things.
Yeah. Well, there's also the fact that when you think about times in our life when we are bringing order to something, it like takes conscious attention. Like if you imagine like it's the night before you're going somewhere and you're packing a suitcase, stuff is strewn everywhere. Your room is a mess, and you need to like create a suitcase that has like 3 pairs of socks, 3 folded shirts, whatever. It's going to be this orderly thing, okay? And you're doing that. Try listening to a podcast while you're doing it. You can't. You have to think consciously unless you travel all the time. And this is interesting.
No, I'm laughing because I failed at this last night. I was packing to go away for the weekend while trying to re-listen to the Jordan Peterson podcast, and it was useless.
Yeah, you'll get glimpses, like your consciousness will shift and you can pay attention to the podcast, but then you can't make the decisions you need to make to pack because that takes conscious attention. Now, if you do something long enough, like if you travel 50 times a year for 20 years, you'll get to a point where it requires less and less conscious attention. Same with driving somewhere. The first day you drive to work, that takes all kinds of conscious attention. You can't listen to a podcast then either, but that becomes completely rote. So it's the bringing of order, the initial bringing of order that seems to involve conscious attention. If you look at all the things in our body that are just really super routinized, my heart beating and so on, they seem to not require conscious attention. Now, I say seem to because it's not impossible that my heart has its own little consciousness and there's a heart in there thinking, I'm so insulted that Bob doesn't realize I'm a sentient being or something, but I don't think so. I think the deal is that the initial bringing of order to things requires conscious attention, but routinized order may not require consciousness. But in any event, it is a demonstrable fact that consciousness is associated in our own experience with the bringing of order to things. And that's a very interesting fact.
Yeah. And in terms of the creative evolution that comes from that process, the thought I had was that through the logos, through speech and instantiation and being, the creative insight, in a way, is somewhat of a prototype. It needs to be tested in the fire of dialogue and reason and sort of the marketplace of ideas to see if it has legs. And it's sort of like that. That's how the program itself gets the novel elements of it debugged in a way. Does that make sense?
Through communication among beings?
Yeah. I mean, that seems like a vital aspect or vital dimension to this developmental evolution.
Yeah, I'm just thinking this through for the maybe the first time. I mean, feedback is central to a lot of this. I mean, natural selection is a feedback system, right? It's like puts out this particular kind of organism tends to die young. That's negative feedback. That model didn't work. So you can imagine innovation and improvement, as happens in biological evolution, without communication in the sense that we normally use it. So it's not like human speech is essential to successful innovation. On the other hand, feedback is pretty integral to it, and speech is one way of giving feedback. You can view natural selection as a giant information processing system, and as a feedback system. And that's a good example of a sense in which the cultural evolution that does tend to involve speech, again, doesn't have to. I mean, like if I observe somebody doing something that works when they're picking fruit or something, they don't have to tell me about it. I can just see that it works and start doing it. And somebody sees that it works for me and they start doing it. So imitation can lead to the proliferation of successful models and so on. But it's true that, speech is very important. And it's very important in the sheer coordination of human society. So again, it's related to order in that way. Leave innovation aside, just the day-to-day preservation of social order involves communication among beings.
And the development of the moral good, too, which is situated within your Dharma. It's like how do people appreciate the development of their own placement in a non-zero sum dynamic so as to lead towards, I think, more win-win outcomes. Is that reasonably accurate to say about your model?
Well, certainly the Logos, to do the work that Philo wants it to do and that I'd like it to do, which is to help us appreciate that there's kind of more going on here than is immediately obvious. In other words, the whole thing is maybe adding up to something, maybe something good, maybe even something that merits the term divine. I think I would say if that's the case, then yeah, it would be really great if you could show that there's moral progress, if not always present in the system, at least ultimately present in the system. And, I have a way of talking about that, that it does involve non-zero sum games and so on. I think in this particular conversation, it would be a mistake to try to get into that. I do want to read something Philo said, that this is like the last thing in the last page of my book, Nonzero, and then I got into it in more depth in The Evolution of God. But, non-zero sumness. So as you suggested, a non-zero sum game is one where there isn't just a winner and a loser. It's not like singles tennis where every point's good for one person, bad for the other. It's more like doubles where the two teammates can either both win or both lose on each point. And then there's all these intermediate forms where it's not like win-win, lose-lose, but it could be technically one person wins a lot and the other doesn't lose anything or loses just a little. But the point is that the sums don't come to zero. add up to zero. In any event, the one big form of non-zero sumness is complementarity. Like if, the way division of labor works in the economy, or say, you're a farmer, I'm a craftsman, I'm very good at making, plows or something. You're very good at using them to harvest fruit and vegetables. We swap, and we both come out better than we would if we were on our own, because it's hard to do everything, right? Specialization carries economy. So that's one form of complementarity that is non-zero sum. Well, Philo didn't have the language of game theory available, but here's a quote from him. And here he's not just talking about different people. He's talking about different people, different peoples, different species. He's talking about the whole organic world that have different strengths and weaknesses, different things to bring to the table, so to speak. And he writes, and this would be in his view, a description of the logos, but he's writing about God. But again, and we can get into this down the road, God is, in this view, in some sense, is the logos. The logos is in a way the mind of God, you could say, or whatever. But anyway, he says that God, quote, this is Philo writing, God, quote, has made none of these particular things complete in itself, so that it should have no need at all of other things. So, in other words, this is why one reason we need each other is because we have different things to bring to the table. He writes, thus, through the desire to obtain what it needs, it must perforce approach that which can supply its needs, and this approach must be mutual and reciprocal. Thus, through reciprocity and combination, even as a lyre, L-Y-R-E, the instrument, even as a lyre is formed of unlike notes, God meant that they should come to fellowship and concord and form a single harmony, and that a universal give and take should govern them and lead up to the consummation of the whole world. And it was part of his view that humankind is evolving toward a single global community. I think he even goes so far as to say it would be a democracy, but that's not exactly what he's describing in that passage. But that would be a manifestation of what he's describing in that passage. One manifestation would be the way humans are drawn into interdependence, into a giant web of interdependence, and that's certainly related to my own worldview. And I mean, it's kind of the worldview I had spelled out in the book Nonzero. And then at the very end, I came across this quote from him. I had never heard of him. And it was actually from a book on free trade. It was near the end of this book on free trade. They quote Philo. And it seemed very apt, so I quoted him, but I didn't really get into the logos until, or look into his work more deeply until the evolution of God. But
so here's one of my questions as an alien from outer space. Was Philo's conception of the logos very influential on, or how influential was? I gather that it was, but I'm trying to ascertain the degree of influence that Philo's conception of the logos had on, say, John's gospel. Well,
that I don't know for sure, because he wasn't the only one using the term. And again, I'm not an expert. I think he could have had a very direct influence. He was, because he was writing around, he was living and writing, I believe, I should check this, but right around the time of Jesus. And the Gospel of John was written some decades after Jesus died, I think, by conventional reckoning. Mm-hmm. So, and he was a very influential person, and of course he was Jewish, and we think of John as a Christian text, but of course Jesus fundamentally thought of himself as Jewish. Right? He had a kind of Judaism that apparently wasn't welcome in all corners, but and it probably had political implications that weren't welcome, but the people writing the book of John, whoever wrote the book of John, presumably would have thought of themselves as writing in a Jewish context, and the idea of Jesus as being the Messiah and the Savior would have been a particular, I think, still at that point. I mean, it's hard to say, a particular take on Judaism. I mean, don't hold me to that. It's very complicated. The question of, well, at what point can we start talking about a Christianity that's distinct from Judaism? And Paul, the great organizer of the Christian church, had already been active, I think, by the time John was written. But this is a long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer to your question. Philo wasn't the only one using the term, but I've got to think, he's a very influential guy, a very prominent guy, and I've got to think his ideas were influential.
Yeah, and as you're talking, the question that occurs to me is, you've been describing how one can see this directional development, this teleological movement, independent of any kind of theological agreement or worldview. You can have a strictly materialistic view and perceive the evidence for that, that telos. But I guess the question that I would like to hear you speak to is, how do you see the logos operative within the theological experience of the divine or development of the divine? Like what is theologically what's the mechanism of the logos within the Christian theology?
Well, I'm not a Christian theologian, and there are lots of Christian theologians who probably don't make much use of the concept at all. But I think in Philo's worldview, it is on the one hand a manifestation of God. It is almost like the unfolding of history is bringing you in touch with, in a certain sense, the mind of God. And then there are ways, and it is suggestive of ways we should behave to bring ourselves in closer alignment with the divine. And those ways are good for us. There's a big, the idea of wisdom, even wisdom as a goddess, is very prominent naturally in the wisdom literature, and including the part of the Bible as part of the wisdom literature, like the book of Proverbs. But it's prominent in Philo's worldview that if we respond wisely and live our lives wisely in accordance with just the way things are in the world, we reflect on the way things are and say, well, then I guess the wise thing would be to behave like this, and to delay gratification, to not.
Do you know the Zen story about the student who comes to the Zen master and says, "What's the most important thing?"
No. What's the answer?
Wisdom.
Oh,
but then the student says
that was surprisingly un-Zen-like in its clarity.
No, it's not over. It's not over. So then the student doesn't get it, and the student asks, "Well, how do you get wisdom?" And the Zen master says, "Good judgment." The student still doesn't.
I would think leads to the question: how do you get good judgment?
And the Zen master just gruffly says, "Bad judgment."
Well, yeah, it's feedback.
Right, the feedback. And it seems like, and this is what I was trying to get at, is like, it seems like the logos is a key element of the feedback loop of testing one's hypothesis about what will make things better. Yeah.
Well, and in the wisdom literature, you find, just statements about, look, like envy tends to do this to you. Jealousy tends to do that. Stealing another man's wife tends to do that. They have bad outcomes. History shows. That's the assertion, at least. I mean, of course, your mileage may vary, but the assertion is that wisdom consists in recognizing that certain kinds of things in a probabilistic sense, are bad. They're probably going to work out badly for you. The guy whose wife you steal, there's a real chance he's going to come kill you. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff you see in the wisdom literature and in the Hebrew Bible and in Philo's, worldview. I think, coming into alignment with the Logos involves, among other things, wisdom. And to get back to the mystical part, that wisdom should lead you to recognize that the life of reason, the life that isn't slavishly in compliance with animal impulses, is a better life, Philo would say. And to the extent that the reasoning part of your mind is holding sway, then you are partaking of the Logos, because the Logos is a reasoning principle, and you're like getting the picture. You're like getting what the Logos is trying to tell you is as it unfolds. So you are coming into alignment with the divine. He would say, I think, in those moments when he himself was so had been so contemplative, and I think he would say ascetic and devoted to reason and kind of dismissive of animal impulses. In those moments, he was having a kind of communion with the divine. The other thing I'd say, I don't know that he says this, but in my view, the other thing about recognizing the logic of the Logos is, okay, it can be good for you via wisdom. It can be good for others because it will make you a more moral person, and it can sustain the direction of the system. And I would say help push the world, draw the world across the threshold to a global community. That would be.
Right. Sorry, I'm getting hammered by leaf cleanup. It seems like
I think that's a sign from the Logos that maybe we've gone on about an hour. I would just close. I mean, I'm actually hearing things at my end too. More evidence is a sign from the Logos, but I would just close by saying, if you're not interested in theology, but you're interested in this weird simulation stuff, and you're like, well, suppose we were living in a simulation. What would be the point? Like, suppose it's even just a video game. Well, what climax are we being driven toward by the algorithm? If you want to think about this in those terms, I think it is still, the Logos is the kinds of things that, the kinds of arguments I would make using the term Logos, or the kinds of scenarios I would lay out, have relevance to that question. It's in a certain sense the same question as the theological question. So that's it. It's not it. I mean, there's a lot more to say.
Yeah, I feel like we just scratched the surface in a way, of
the Logos, let alone
right again. Yeah, exactly. I would like to explore with you further about how. The thing that I think that Peterson speaks to nicely is that it's as though the book of Genesis is describing phenomenologically the implicit structures of experience. And I feel like, my sense of listening to him now and then thinking about it in terms of the Dharma is that one of the things that Dharma practice, particularly the practice of meditation, does is it makes those implicit structures more explicit, and which seems to factor into the ability of one who becomes conscious of those implicit structures to, in a sense, amplify or accelerate their participation with the evolution of the good.
By implicit becoming explicit, you mean the person becomes more aware of them?
Yeah, I mean, you become aware of the sort of the unconscious. You become aware of what the nature of consciousness, and you become more aware of the content within your experience and how you're interacting with it.
Well, and I think Philo would say that kind of awareness can be part of bringing yourself in closer alignment with the logos.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we talk again, maybe you should tell me which Jordan Peterson lectures to listen to, and I'll do that. As long as you don't name too many.
It'll be one or two.
I can do that.
And I apologize for the yard cleanup on my end.
It didn't really come over at my end, so that's fine. And your sound is good. I may buy one of those little backstops myself.
I mean,
which, as you know, it is dual purpose, but
multi-purpose.
I hope to only use it for one purpose. I'm not surprised. I mean, because when we speak, I guess about half of the sound waves probably go below the level that is the top of that thing, and so they would go into that and be absorbed rather than bouncing around.
Yeah,
that's good.
In theory.
Well, thank you for being so indulgent and letting me.
I mean, for me, this is very, very engaging and thought provoking. I feel like, is the word inchoate, like something's incipient in one's mind. Like, I feel like I'm coming to a new understanding of my relationship to the Buddha Dharma through like this discussion and through
that's interesting.
Thinking about these things.
That's interesting. We should talk more about that. But yeah, inchoate is presumably the one thing the logos does is make things less inchoate as it actually operates in the world. That's a property you would attribute to it.
So maybe our conversation will be somewhat of a developmental process.
Part of the one small
drop
in the logos. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. So let's do this again, and I think we'll do it more than once.
At least until we adequately feel that you are able to articulate and preserve for posterity the messianic vision that is within your head.
Okay.
Humility aside.
I actually, embarrassment aside. I mean, I do have a little bit of a messianic streak, I have to say, but I'm telling you, if you had been brought up like in a series of Southern Baptist churches, and you'd be like this too. It's intense. It wasn't that intense. I don't want to exaggerate it, but the Book of Revelations was like my favorite book. As a kid, naturally, it's the closest thing the Bible has to a video game. It's wild.
I'll have to read that.
Yeah, totally. Just read it it's wild.
All right.
Psychedelic. Okay, well, thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Bob.
And we'll see you next time.
Good to see you.